Thanks for joining us on this latest webisode of All Politics Are Local. I'm WSAV digital reporter John Dowding. Every week we break down news coming from Washington, D.C. to understand how it affects us right here in the Coastal Empire and the Low Country. Let's get started. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders quickly became the frontrunner and came out on top in Saturday night's caucus in Nevada. Sanders was campaigning in Texas the night of the caucuses ahead of the Lone Star State's primary on Super Tuesday. Former Vice President Joe Biden and former Mayor Pete Buttigieg finished second and third, respectively, in that race in Nevada. Exit polls showed Sanders won over voters from different demographics in the party.
In Nevada, we have just put together a multi-generational, multi-racial coalition, which is going to not only win in Nevada, it's going to sweep this country.
Joining us live from Washington, D.C. to talk about the impact of the latest races is WSAV Washington Bureau Correspondent Kellie Meyer. Thanks for joining us as always, Kellie.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. All right. So a lot of stuff happened this weekend. So let's talk about what was going on in Nevada. Who were some of those key demographic groups that helped cast their votes for Senator Sanders and helped him ultimately win in Nevada?
Yeah, well, Nevada was Senator Sanders' first test if he was going to get the support from the Latino community as well as the African-American community. And it seemed that he passed that test on Saturday, which gives him that gain in momentum going into South Carolina, where we see former Vice President Joe Biden, who has had that support from the African-American community. But that seems to be dropping a little bit since the fall, and with the momentum that Sanders has going into that. Biden did win among black voters in Nevada, but just barely. And of course, Sanders won among Latino voters in Nevada on Saturday.
And I mean, early on in the night during the caucuses in Nevada, Bernie Sanders had a definitive lead. I believe the big three stations, ABC, NBC, CBS, all called the race with only 4% of the voting precincts reporting. So what does that show about voters in the state?
Yeah, and it seemed like, they were still counting, coming in with the caucus as well. But they knew they also had some votes that were cast in the early voting part of the Nevada caucuses. They knew that he was going to have this big lead, as we saw on Saturday in Nevada, and it really gives him that push going into South Carolina on Saturday. And then we, of course, have Super Tuesday now just 8 days away, which will be a big delegate gain if Sanders can clinch those states like Texas and California. But Nevada was really interesting to see how he polled there, how he did among, as we said, some of the African-American community and Latino community, and then how that will kind of maybe give an idea of how he may do in South Carolina. But of course, two different sides of the country, two very different states.
And well, let's go to that other side of the country right now and shift gears and talk about South Carolina. Democratic hopefuls are working to win this last influential primary before the Super Tuesday vote. Tom Steyer is campaigning in Hilton Head today ahead of this Saturday's vote. Elizabeth Warren will hold events in Charleston this week alongside singer John Legend. And currently, Joe Biden still has a slight lead in the most recent polling. And this weekend on Meet the Press, Congressman James Clyburn explained why the primary in the Palmetto State is so important for the candidates.
So South Carolina has a demographic that lends itself well to Democratic voters especially. So I think that if you can win South Carolina decisively, I think it will set the stage for Super Tuesday, and you will become the odds-on favorite.
Like you said, Kellie, a lot of those demographic groups that Democratic candidates were trying to win over in South Carolina, they're also trying, in Nevada, they're also trying to do in South Carolina. So this is going to be a big vote happening right across the river here this Saturday. So how will Nevada impact voters in South Carolina, the results in Nevada, I should say, before they hit the polls this Saturday in South Carolina?
Well, it's interesting. One of the polls I was reading this morning, it was from CBS News, who is going to have the next debate coming up on Tuesday night. And that last debate that you'll see candidates before they head into the South Carolina primary on Saturday. But that was taken before the results came out in the Nevada caucuses on Saturday. So that really didn't have an effect on voters there from what was happening in Nevada. They showed Bernie Sanders right behind the former Vice President Joe Biden in these polls in South Carolina. But interesting that you mentioned the South Carolina Congressman Jim Clyburn. He's expected to announce his support for Joe Biden coming up on Wednesday. That's interesting because, you know, he will be able to, with his endorsement, it could bring other political candidate, or, you know, those in politics or supporters of that congressman. He has a big pull in the state. So to see if anyone else comes on board after his endorsement, see if that encourages any other African-American voters to come out and support Biden that maybe were on the fence before, that can be an interesting endorsement to see ahead of Saturday. But we'll see if Saturday really is that comeback that Joe Biden is looking for in this race. But as you said, we go into Super Tuesday right after the South Carolina primary. Bernie Sanders is racking up these delegates and racking up those numbers to see if he could clinch that nomination. As we know, in 2016, Hillary Clinton clinched that nomination for the Democratic nomination on Super Tuesday. And it seems that Bernie Sanders is on that track to head that way as well. But of course, Biden wants to derail him on Saturday, and he still has high hopes that he can do that.
And I mean, you just touched on how Sanders has been gaining momentum in the last couple of weeks, and you spoke about, you know, how he's come out on top or slightly in the lead in the last couple states. So how is he presenting a threat to Joe Biden's hopes, aside from obviously delegate counts and winning the various states that have had primaries and caucuses? How else is he presenting a threat to Biden's hopes of hopefully winning the nomination?
Well, I think just what we said there early in the conversation, that he was gaining that support from the Latino and African-American communities, and seeing that support growing for him in South Carolina as well, and then decreasing for Biden as Sanders is increasing. So Biden has been weighing and relying on this vote for him in South Carolina. He thinks he could win the vote among African-Americans in South Carolina, but if Bernie comes in and takes some of those votes away, it could make for an interesting night on Saturday.
And again, besides trying to gain support in the African-American community, which is extremely influential and a major reason as to why all these candidates are trying to win over the Palmetto State, why else are candidates really trying to fight to win in South Carolina this Saturday?
Yeah, I think you said, you know, the diversity in the state, you know, one of the first tests kind of in the southern areas, and then also the kind of indicator of how they'll do going into Super Tuesday. I think whoever wins in the South Carolina primary, it gives them that momentum moving into such a big day on Tuesday where so many delegates are up for grabs. You see Texas and California, really big states with a lot of delegates to grab. So it really gives that momentum going into that day. South Carolina is very important. And for some of them, it might be that last test if they're going to stay in this race.
And you just mentioned Super Tuesday. So before we go, let's talk a little bit about Super Tuesday. Why is that such a major impact, and what does it really mean for those Democratic candidates ahead in the campaigns?
Yeah, I think it could mean the end of some campaigns for many of the candidates. I imagine you'll see a few of them likely dropping out of the race after South Carolina and Super Tuesday. They just won't have that support and the numbers and the donations to go in to continue. And if you see someone like Bernie Sanders, who the math just adds up for him to clinch that nomination, it just maybe not make sense for the rest of the candidates to stay in the race. So that's why South Carolina and Super Tuesday are so important. They could be game enders for many of the candidates, and they could maybe be a game changer for some of them.
Well, definitely a lot to look forward to in the next couple of weeks, and by the end of this week too, definitely we'll be able to see people start dropping out and see where we're going to be headed in the Democratic nomination process. Well, thank you so much, Kelly. This is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for breaking all of this down and helping us better understand all this news from Capitol Hill.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And you can see more of Kellie's stories on our website at wsav.com/Washington. News 3 is your local election headquarters, so make sure to stick with News 3 on air and online for the very latest. Thank you for watching. I'm John Dowding. We'll see you again next week on All Politics Are Local.